Up to me, yeah, that's right.
Deputy Mayor Dean.
That's right.
All right.
And my clock's not saying 6:30 yet, so I'm just sitting here and chilling. So
I have 6:28, I believe.
that's where I am.
Yep. I wanted to change the clock on this computer because it says it's 10:30 p.m. And I was going, no, really not.
Jackie, if I can ask a quick question, are you going to be able to advance the slides for both my presentation and for Mr. Shuttleworth?
Yes, I already talked to Mr. Shuttleworth, and he'll tell me next slide. If you'd like to drive yourself, that's up to you. I can do the same for you.
Do you need me to have my PowerPoint up here on my screen for me to drive myself?
Yeah. Yeah, if you would
do
like
so.
to drive yourself, then you can. I'll make you co-host real quick.
Alrighty, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so it is 6:30. Are we ready to go, Jackie?
Yes, we're ready.
Perfect. All right, then I'd like to welcome everybody this evening to the Sunnyside City Council workshop for Monday, May 3, 2021. This meeting is being held via the Zoom conferencing application to enable council members, city staff, and residents to participate remotely. Please allow one person to speak at a time. I will call on every member to make sure you've had an opportunity to ask questions. And I'll now ask City Clerk Renteria to start our roll call.
Deputy Mayor Boersma,
I am here.
Councillor Farmer,
Here.
Councillor Henry,
I'm here.
Councillor Restucci,
Here.
Councillor Hicks,
Here.
Councillor Hart,
Here.
City Manager Casey,
Here.
City Clerk Renteria. I'm here. Sorry. Finance Director Alba. Here. Fire Chief Anderson. Oh, I think he was out.
He was out sick today,
Police
so
Chief,
I'm not sure he's going to be able to join us this evening.
Police Chief Escalera.
I'm here.
Public Work. Oh, he's out too. Public Works
Yeah.
Director Fisher is out of office today.
Yeah, he's on vacation leave.
Deputy Mayor, we have Mayor Guerrero absent today.
Very well, thank you, Madam City Clerk. Mayor Guerrero has requested an excused absence for tonight's meeting. If there is no objection, we'll go ahead and excuse him for tonight.
No objection.
All right, hearing no objections, our mayor is excused for the evening. Moving on to our active agenda, item 1, legislative session review. I know in the paper over the weekend, there was a bit of a summary of the impact for Yakima County. I'm sure our city manager has much more detail for us here as it impacts the city of Sunnyside. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I'll go ahead and share my screen and then start the PowerPoint presentation. And hopefully that goes smoothly. Let me. There we go. For those looking on phones or screens, hopefully everyone can see the slide legislative update. council workshop presentation title slide. Move on to the next. As Deputy Mayor referred to, the media have been providing a number of summary and kind of diagnostics of what went on in this year's 2021 legislative session. And it was very significant in a number of areas. And I'll be focusing primarily on legislation that had some impact on cities, municipal governments, and some of the issues that we deal with. This isn't going to try to cover everything that passed in the legislative session. In any given legislative session, they may consider up to 2,000 to 3,000 pieces of legislation. Typically only a few hundred actually get all the way through the process to the governor's desk and signed into law, but that's still quite a volume of activity. The first couple of slides I just provided for context. I won't go over all the process steps, but I just wanted to kind of share with council the various steps that the legislature goes through in considering a bill. And what's one thing that's kind of noteworthy about that is that there are multiple opportunities to both change legislation as well as to slow it down or stop it. And so it's, as I said, not unusual for far more bills to be introduced than actually make it through the process. This year, the legislature actually adjourned on time. Over the last 20, 30 years, that's happened far less often than not. In fact, it's been rather more common for the legislature to have to go into a special session where they are called back in by the governor for up to 30 days, often to deal with budgetary issues or significant policy issues. But this year, they did adjourn on time after 105 days on April 25th. And that gives the governor until the middle of this month, I think roughly May 14th or 15th, until roughly the middle of this month to sign the bills that came out of the end of the legislative process. And with that, I'm going to move into kind of a series of topics or themes and then group bills that passed the legislature under these. The first area I'll talk about is a little bit of what the legislature did in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a fair amount of activity early on in the session, especially as we were coming out of our winter surge of COVID infections in the state. The legislature went ahead. There was work they had to do to go ahead and appropriate some of the funds that came to the state out of the 2020 CARES Act. There were adjustments they made to kind of codify things that either the governor or executive agencies had done to adjust for the pandemic. So for example, House Bill 1480, or actually this ended up being engrossed second substitute House Bill 1480, which basically is legislative speak for it got amended back and forth 3 different times before the House and Senate finally agreed on it. The Liquor and Cannabis Board had issued some temporary rules during session to assist restaurants and bars and taverns and distilleries and wineries with how to adjust to providing services and access to their products when so much in-person dining or in-person service was shut down. And so it allowed them certain temporary privileges for curbside service and pickup and premixed cocktails. That bill was codified and basically took the Liquor and Cannabis Board's temporary rules, allowed them to be maintained for the duration of the pandemic emergency, and then actually directed the Liquor and Cannabis Board further to actually conduct a study, an independent study. They have to contract for it, can't do it in-house, an independent study to evaluate the effects and impacts of these temporary privileges that will remain in force through the end of the pandemic emergency. Similarly, Senate Bill 5161, which is also an engrossed second substitute, addresses the eviction moratoriums that had been put in place under the governor's orders. It actually, among several things, ends the pandemic eviction or moratorium statewide on June 30th. By some estimates, there are several thousand tenants across the state who are behind on their rent because of COVID economic impacts, lost jobs or reduced wages or what have you. So there's been an eviction moratorium in place that will end on June 30th in little less than 2 months from now. What the bill does is also, though, it requires landlords to offer reasonable payment plans. And that payment plan cannot exceed more than 1/3 on a monthly basis, 1/3 of their normal rent payment. So if they need time to pay that back, they can offer and provide that payment plan for them to do so. It also expands some eligibility for landlords under some COVID aid programs. And for the first time statewide, it will guarantee tenants who are facing eviction legal representation, and they're still working the details out of that. That's one of the challenges with this bill is community legal aid groups and so forth are concerned about their ability to scale up to be able to represent tenants as early as July. Oh, is there a question? As early as July. So not yet clear how that's going to play out, but there is some funding provided in the budget to assist with this. Another example of an adjustment that was made was found that some healthcare providers, in particular dentists, were having issues with their insurance providers where they would bill for the extra PPE that they were having to use with patients, and their insurance providers were refusing to reimburse for that expense. And so this bill requires healthcare providers to be able to get reimbursed at a rate of $6.57 for each patient encounter. All those bills have already been signed by the governor. They were passed earlier at some point in the session and either have taken effect or will be taking effect here in July. The next two bills mentioned are coming, still pending before the governor. This Senate bill 5115, this actually could have an effect on the city as an employer. This bill creates, for workers' compensation purposes, our workers' compensation claims, it creates what's called an occupational disease presumption, which is that frontline employees who become infected with a disease during the public health emergency, it is presumed that they are infected through their workplace. And that's a rebuttable presumption. That means the employer can try to rebut that and show that, in fact, the employee wasn't infected through their workplace, but may have been infected elsewhere. But it puts the burden of proof on the employer first to rebut the presumption that the employee was infected at work. It adds a number of other reporting requirements. Employers with more than 50 employees at a workplace must notify L&I when 10 or more of their workforce become infected during a public health emergency. It also requires certain written notices to employees and to their unions of potential exposure to infections during the public health emergency that may be taking place at the workplace. So that's one that our human resources and finance teams will be taking a look at to see if it would require, what kinds of adjustments it may require to how we would do communication, notification, and our workers' compensation claims in the future. Again, if the governor signs this into law, he has not yet taken action on this one. The next bill related to COVID is kind of misplaced here, but there's some elements in it, and that's the big state operating budget. I mentioned before there was an earlier bill that allocated the state's CARES Act funds from last year. This bill, the operating budget for 2021-23, House Bill 1368, includes allocations for the funds that have come from this year's federal stimulus act, the American Rescue Plan. And again, still waiting to see how some of that shakes out. This is mostly how they're going to allocate the state's money. Still waiting for direction from U.S. Treasury on how the Treasury Department is going to be allocating money for the cities. But I did want to note there are some things that are of interest to us. Obviously, a big push around vaccine deployment, a big push to support educational institutions in getting schools reopened, and then tying back into the rental and tenant issues, assistance for rental, money for rental assistance and for foreclosure aid. And the governor hasn't acted on the budget yet, but that'll be coming. And Deputy Mayor, I can hold for questions until the end, or would you prefer to kind of have questions at each segment?
Well, how many segments do you have, I guess I would ask?
We're on slide 4 of 14.
Okay, so let's ask if there's any questions at this point. So council, you've heard what we've had on the first section here. I'm going to read down the list of council members and give each of you an opportunity to comment if you'd like to. Afterwards, we will move on to the next section of the legislative session. And I will begin with Councilor Hart. Have you any questions?
Not at this time.
Thank you. Councilor Farmer, any questions?
Not yet.
Councilor Hicks?
No questions right now.
Councilor Henry?
No questions at this time, sir.
Councilor Restucci?
No questions, sir.
And I also have no questions. Mr. City Manager, you may carry on.
All right. Well, my next section is the longest section. Thematically, it's about 3 slides. So buckle up. Here we go. This is policing reforms. The legislature devoted a great deal of time, effort, and attention to a variety of approaches to address policing in the state. I think it's fair to say that many observers were surprised by how much significant legislation made its way through the legislature this year. Most of these bills have not yet been considered or signed by the governor, so these are still under consideration. So I'll just go through. The first one I'll talk about is engrossed substitute House Bill 1054. This focuses on police tactics and activities. It prohibits police officers from using chokeholds, which are defined as restricting the airway, or neck restraints, which are defined as constricting the blood flow to the brain. It prohibits law enforcement from using or seeking from a court what's called a no-knock warrant, which means a warrant that allows an exception to the knock and announce rule. It also places restrictions and guidance around vehicle pursuits, firing upon a moving vehicle, or the use of surplus military equipment by the police. It originally essentially barred all use of surplus military equipment by police agencies. An exception was carved out as the bill made its way through the process to allow what's called MRAPs, which are mortar resistant armored something or others. It's the armored vehicles that we most often saw associated with deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan. It requires uniformed officers to clearly display their name or other identifying information while on duty. It also prohibits the use of tear gas, except in very limited situations, and only after the jurisdiction's highest elected official so authorizes. So it can't be authorized administratively or solely administratively. Someone elected by the people, by the voters of the jurisdiction, has to authorize the use of tear gas. So that is currently on its way to the governor's office or governor's desk. In addition, House Bill 1089. This would require the state auditor to review any completed deadly force investigations to determine whether the involved actors, the agencies involved, the officers involved, complied with all applicable rules and regulations governing how investigations are done. It also authorizes the state auditor, upon the request of the Criminal Justice Training Commission, to review a law enforcement agency to ensure it is complying with all applicable rules and procedures governing the training and certification of their law enforcement officer. So this inserts the statewide office of the state auditor into oversight of both deadly force investigations as well as local agency training practices. Next is engrossed substitute House Bill 1267. This establishes an Office of Independent Investigations within the Office of the Governor for the purpose of investigating deadly force incidents involving law enforcement officers. The Office of Independent Investigations will have jurisdiction to investigate any incident involving use of deadly force after July 1 of 2022. The office may also investigate prior incidents if new evidence is brought forward that was not included in the initial investigation. So most of the focus is forward-looking, but it does have an ability to look back. To get this going, the governor is required to appoint an 11-member advisory board, and then that advisory board will give recommendations on the hiring of the first director. And the agency is also empowered to hire investigative staff and so forth. So it'll take about a year to get ramped up and running, but after July 1, 2022, they'll begin their work. Continuing on police reforms, engrossed second substitute House Bill 1310 establishes for the first time a statewide standard for police use of force. And I've actually, because of kind of the precision involved with this, and gone ahead and just kind of cited directly from the bill reports and statute on this one as to the circumstances under which an officer can use physical force, probable cause to make an arrest, to effect an arrest, prevent an escape, protect against imminent threat of bodily injury to a peace officer or other person, or the person against whom force is being used. Deadly force against another person may only occur when necessary to protect against an imminent threat of serious physical injury or death to that officer or another person. In addition to setting this statutory standard, this bill also requires the Attorney General's office to develop model policies on use of force and de-escalation tactics. Those have to be completed by July of 2022. And once adopted by September of 2022, all law enforcement agencies in the state must adopt that model policy or policies substantially consistent with the model policies for use in their local jurisdictions. In addition, the bill requires local agencies, if they then change their policies, to notify the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is required to publish annual reports on agencies' policies. Senate Bill 5066 addresses some of the issues that had arrived where there were concerns about other officers observing or not intervening. So this bill now would put into law that an identifiable on-duty law enforcement officer must intervene when they witness a colleague using excessive force, and when safe to do so, to end that excessive use of force. And they are required to render aid to any person injured as a result of use of force at the earliest safe opportunity. Similarly, on-duty officers who witness wrongdoing committed by another officer, or who has a good faith belief that the other officer has committed wrongdoing, must report that wrongdoing to their own supervisor, or in accordance with whatever the agency's reporting procedures are. The law then goes on to prohibit retaliation against any officer who does report wrongdoing or intervenes in good faith. It must report any disciplinary action that it takes as a result of an officer failing to intervene. And that has to be reported to the Criminal Justice Training Commission. And again, model policies. By December of this year, the Criminal Justice Training Commission, along with the State Patrol, the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, and organizations representing state and local law enforcement officers, must develop a written model policy on the duty to intervene. And then by June of next year, 2022, all law enforcement agencies will be required to adopt and implement a written policy on duty to intervene. And third slide, Senate Bill 5119. This deals with deaths in custody. This bill requires, it also affects the State Department of Corrections, but I'm focusing just on the local government here. A city or county jail, their chief law enforcement, who's responsible for the operation of that jail, must conduct a, I think we're getting some feedback on Councilor Farmer's line. Oh, thank you, sir. Must conduct a review and convene a fatality review team to conduct a review when an individual confined within their jail dies, and the law enforcement officer must, or the chief law enforcement officer must release a report within 120 days of the fatality to their governing authority and the legislature. There is an extension option. The chief executive of the city or the county's legislative authority, in the case of a county jail, may grant an extension of the 120-day limit. Once the report is complete, it has to be transmitted to the legislature, and then the Department of Health must also maintain a website of all these reports. Senate Bill 5259. This was actually probably the most widely supported of these bills. Senate Bill 5259 requires the state's attorney general to contract with one of the state's institutions of higher education to create a public use of force database. They have to start with, they have to set up an advisory group, define the parameters of all this, and then go and contract for it. And then once the database is completed, which they didn't set a fixed deadline for that, but once it's completed, every law enforcement agency in the state will be required to report each incident where an officer used force. And there's a long list of all the circumstances that have to be included and reported on in this one. And then lastly, Senate Bill 5263. This one's a little arcane, bit of trial law, but under existing law, it is a complete defense to any lawsuit for damages for personal injury or wrongful death that the person injured or killed was engaging in the commission of a felony at the time, which was a proximate cause of the injury or death. And kind of translating that out of legalese, what that means is if someone was committing a felony and their actions in committing that felony was a proximate cause of their death or injury, then that's a complete defense against someone else being sued for damages out of that incident. So if an officer is somehow involved in trying to apprehend the person while they're committing the felony, but something about their actions contributed to their death, then that's a defense under existing law. Under this bill, in actions arising out of law enforcement activities that result in injury or death, the defense, the officer must prove both elements of the defense. First, that the person injured or killed was committing a felony, and that the felony act was the proximate cause of the injury or death beyond a reasonable doubt. So it does significantly change the standard by which an officer would have to defend. They essentially have to prove the crime first, and then prove that the crime contributed to the death, in order to have a successful defense under this bill. All of these bills have passed the legislature and are awaiting the governor's action at this time. We have heard through the Association of Washington Cities, and I haven't confirmed this separately myself yet, but in various places in the operating budget, there's money for implementation aid to cities through some of these programs and activities. And with that, I'll pause and before we go on to other criminal justice issues, but see if there's any questions on policing reforms.
All right. Thank you, Mr. City Manager. I'll go down the list again. Councilor Restucci, do you have any questions?
Quick question, Mr. City Manager. We discussed this at our lunch on Friday. Did you look into 1054 and the issue related to HEO?
So I have not seen any legal analysis of this. The issue with 1054 that is,
I can
the
summarize.
tear
if you
gas,
want
on the
to.
tear gas issue, is the legislature adopted a standard whereby in the final days of session, they adopted a standard that only the highest elected authority in a jurisdiction can authorize the use of tear gas. Well, they essentially borrowed a federal structure for that. In council manager forms of government like Sunnyside and like many other cities, the mayor is appointed by and selected by from among the council members, and other than the kind of ceremonial presiding role that they have in leading council meetings, do not have much. They don't have more authority on legislative matters than any other council member. That could raise a conflict with federal law. I've seen no discussion yet of whether that's going to be challenged or how the governor may address that, but it does raise an interesting issue because not all mayors are strong mayors.
Well, no, sir. And my concern, that is part of my concern, but the other part of my concern is that 1054 would violate state law. Because RCW 35A13120 makes it very clear that no member of the council or committee of the council can give orders to any subordinate of the city manager. The police chief is your subordinate, and if the police chief wanted to deploy chemical smoke or tear gas, by this law, they would have to ask the mayor of the city, the highest elected official of the city.
Right.
Which means, sir, they could give directions to your subordinate or they could countermand your orders.
Exactly. And so I think that's something that we'll be watching to see if the governor or governor's office raises that concern. It's possible the governor may veto that section in order to resolve that. I do know that this provision was added at the very end of negotiations in order to get it essentially passed and agreed to. The Senate originally did not want to allow any deployment of tear gas, and the House refused to go along with that and insisted on this as a compromise. So if it does survive the governor and is not vetoed, I suspect strongly it'll be litigated.
Thank you, sir. That was my question.
Thank you, Mr. Restucci. Councilor Henry, any questions or comments?
No questions for me, sir.
Councilor Hicks, questions or comments?
No questions.
Councilor Farmer? Councilor Farmer? You are muted. Okay, perhaps he stepped away. We'll give him an opportunity here in a second.
Hey, I'm back. Are you here? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, sir.
Okay, Councilor Restucci asked my questions.
All right, thank you, sir. And Councilor Hart, any questions or comments?
Well, it looks to me like they really took a hard look at what needs to be done as far as policing reform. And so I don't actually have any questions. I'm pretty pleased with how this has turned out. And again, I'm sure there'll be some implications that we haven't foreseen yet, but I'm pretty pleased with how they've tried to wrap their heads around police reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Hart. For myself, my concerns mirror those of Councilor Restucci and Councilor Farmer, to the point where I wouldn't be opposed to us asking the question, to be honest, find out exactly how that is supposed to be implemented in a city like ours. What is the legislature's expectations?
Probably have to.
And yeah, when courts consider these issues, sometimes what they will look at is legislative intent. They may look at the precedent, and sometimes they may choose to argue that a more recent enactment modifies or constrains earlier ones. There's a host of things that would have to be worked out. But all of these bills, I'm kind of that we've been monitoring. There's a number of issues in here that we're going to have to take into consideration if, depending on what the governor does, with how we would either implement them, comply with them, or in some cases, seek the advice of our own attorneys on how to reconcile what may be conflicting.
All right, thank you, sir. I think that's comments and questions from everybody. You may carry on.
All right. So kind of in the theme of continuing the theme of criminal justice, the council's aware that at the beginning of session, about a month in February of this year, the state Supreme Court struck down in its entirety the state's felony drug possession law and held it unconstitutional. The legislature took the opportunity to take a step back and essentially kind of completely re-engage on an approach to drug abuse, drug possession, substance abuse, and addiction, and has signaled a pretty significant shift away from criminalization and incarceration as tools towards treatment and prevention. There was, on many of these provisions, fairly strong bipartisan support in the legislature, but they've kind of hit on an interesting solution given how little time they had to try to work on something so broad and encompassing. They've passed what I characterize or list here as an interim reform bill. They've bought themselves 2 years, essentially, during which time they will continue to try to work towards a more permanent solution in the next 2-year legislative session. So among the provisions of this bill is it creates, instead of a felony drug possession law, it creates a misdemeanor drug possession law. But unless the legislature can come together on different or more, comprehensive reform in the 22 and 23 legislatures, at the end of July, at the beginning of July in 2020, the misdemeanor drug possession law is removed from the books and drug possession becomes a civil infraction. So it kind of, it gives the legislature a deadline to act on this again. It's about, as I said, it's kind of providing them 2 years to kind of keep working on this with the kind of incentive that if they aren't successful in a change, don't make modifications, then even the misdemeanor law goes away. Under the misdemeanor drug possession law, it requires pre-booking diversion to assessment and treatment services on the first 2 instances that law enforcement officers find an individual in possession of a controlled or counterfeit substance. In other words, they cannot refer it to prosecution. It cannot be prosecuted. The first 2 times someone is found in possession of the substances involved, we are required to divert that individual into treatment and assessment. After that, on the third or further instances, prosecutors are then granted discretion under the law to either divert the individual for treatment or may prosecute for misdemeanor possession. It requires the state's healthcare authority to establish an advisory committee to make recommendations for a new substance abuse recovery services plan. The bill also addresses some of the issues around how to process the caseload associated with resentencing and revising the sentences of individuals who were sentenced in part under the simple possession law in the past. The legislative session does dedicate more funds to treatment, quite a bit actually, appears to be flowing through HCA and other entities to try to get these treatment programs in place. But one thing that AWC has pointed out is a bit of a concern is what this effectively does too, is it shifts drug cases from Superior Court, where they were heard as a felony, to municipal courts like ours, where they'll be heard as misdemeanors. And so far, the legislature has not provided direct funding to cities for this caseload. However, they did create a grant program in the Office of Administrator for the Courts, but it's only about $4.5 million. So we're still trying to figure out how some of this is going to shake out and how much of this actually survives the governor's veto pen when it goes forward to him. But this is probably the most substantial revisiting of drug law in this state, perhaps in a generation. And then kind of finishing out criminal justice. This also is a bill that will have an effect here on our local court. Senate Bill 5226 eliminates the penalty of driver's license suspension or revocation because someone has failed to pay a moving violation infraction. So failure to pay your traffic ticket no longer can result in the suspension or revocation of your license. The court is required to offer payment plans. However, if a person does not enter into a payment plan and does not pay in full, then they can refer to collection. It also authorizes the state's Department of Licensing to accept and approve applications to reinstate licenses that were suspended already for failure to pay. There's a new fee that's being added. It's called the, within the Highway Safety Fund, the Driver's License Technology Support Account is created to support the technology system that'll have to be developed by and used by the Department of Licensing to communicate with the judicial information systems of the courts to be able to manage driving records and implement court orders. So there's an increase on the existing traffic infraction fee. The legislative assessment portion of it is increased by $4. And that $4 then goes into this new account to pay for the systems that will make all this work. Courts can still suspend a license if they fail to comply with a payment plan, as I mentioned, or if they fail to show up in court when scheduled to do so. And there's still a revocation option. The Department of Licensing has to revoke a license when a person has committed 3 or more moving violation in a year's time. Now, there's time to get ready for this one. If the bill is signed, it will not take effect until January 1, 2023. And lastly, just a note, this is kind of a small bill, but it affects labor relations. Right now, there's no kind of statewide standard or mechanism setting up arbitrators that are used for arbitrating police disciplinary grievances. Well, after January 1, 2022, the Public Employment Relations Commission must have established a new statewide roster of qualified and vetted arbitrators who will be, regardless of what your bargaining agreement kind of already says about this, who will be selected by PERC. And those will be the arbitrators whom unions and cities or counties or whatever employment agencies will select from for arbitrating police disciplinary grievances. And this bill has actually already been signed by the governor. And with that, I can go on to housing unless there's questions on this.
Well, let's see
Any
if
of
you
these.
have any questions. We'll just go down the list real quickly. Counselor Hicks, any questions? Counselor Hicks?
Sorry, I was getting back to the screen. No questions.
All right, sir. Counselor Henry, any questions?
No questions for me either, sir.
Counselor Restucci, any questions?
No questions, just a comment, SB 5055, this is good for the state. We've had nothing but problems with arbiters in the past, so.
Thank you, sir. Counselor Hart, any questions?
Not at this time.
Counselor Farmer?
None at this time.
I too have no questions. Carry on, Mr. City Manager.
All right. A lot of ground to cover here. Appreciate everyone's patience through this because, as I said, this was a pretty significant legislative session and a lot to cover. The last few slides should go a little more quickly. We've had discussion in council already on House Bill 1220. This was the bill that was going to update the Growth Management Act. It has passed the legislature. It has not yet been signed by the governor or acted upon. As it came out of the legislature, it did change from what we first presented to you, I think, in early March. It does require cities to plan for housing, and actually it kind of changes the GMA. The current Growth Management Act requires cities in their housing plan to encourage moderate and low income and moderate density housing. This just changes the language slightly to strengthen it, and it now requires cities to plan for and accommodate affordable housing, not just encourage it. It also requires cities to review any local policies or zoning or ordinances that may be on the books that may have had racially disparate impacts or displacement effects. And then in their comprehensive plan to identify and implement strategies to correct those impacts. It also directs cities to consider, it doesn't require them to adopt, but it does require them to consider and show consideration of a long list of policies that would encourage the construction of accessory dwelling units to help meet affordable housing goals. And I won't go into the long list, but suffice it to say there's about a dozen different policy options that they want to see cities consider. Now, the bill as it came through the legislature did not make these mandatory. These housing element changes are optional until the legislature funds the added planning costs for cities. So until they fund us with more, with the resources to do this extra work, we're not required to do all these things. One other element, though, that is kind of interesting, and I was noticing it when I go through it. One of the things it does for cities is it now requires the State Department of Commerce to complete the work to provide the inventory and analysis of existing and projected housing needs that are required under the existing GMA for the housing element of the comprehensive plan. Up till now, cities have been tasked with doing that work themselves to inventory and analyze their housing needs. This bill changes that responsibility and assigns it to the Department of Commerce. One thing that I know the Association of Washington Cities had been concerned with was that initially the bill also broadly preempted local authority for citing emergency shelters, supportive housing for the homeless. As amended, beginning September 30, 2021, the bill prohibits a city from, well, that's a double negative. I'll flip it around. Cities must permit transitional or supportive housing in any zone in which residences or hotels are allowed. And emergency shelters must be permitted in any zones in which hotels are allowed. So this bill has passed the legislature and awaits action by the governor. And transportation, I'll just kind of roll through the last couple here and then ask for general questions. This is kind of an interesting report, mainly because the legislature came very close, but did not quite complete work on a major transportation package. They were looking at kind of the next really big transportation infrastructure revenue and construction proposal. They got some of the bills involved in that passed. One of which was, you'll see the low carbon fuel standard policy, House Bill 1091, and the cap and invest policy for carbon, that's Senate Bill 5126. But both bills passed the legislature with provisions that delay their compliance, delay their implementation until the legislature comes back and also approves at least a 5-cent gas tax for additional transportation project funding. So until that gas tax bill passes, which it did not pass this session, they'll have to come back in 2022. Until that passes, or unless that passes, then these bills do not go into effect. So we're expecting a transportation package, obviously, to be front and center in the 22 legislative session. But in the meantime, we're just kind of holding off to wait and see how this will go forward. I suspect the Department of Ecology, which has a role in both of these bills, will be doing some pre-work to get ready in the event that the rest of the package passes next year, but they won't be able to actually go forward with compliance. And then, actually, I want to pause there.
Mr. City Manager?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Deputy Mayor, if I may, this weekend on Inside Olympia, Austin Jenkins asked the Speaker of the House in regards to this transportation package, and she kind of hinted of a special session specifically for this, just so you know.
Okay. It'll be interesting if, Counselor, did she hint at something the governor might call them back, or something the legislature might try to call itself back?
That was where it was heading. It wasn't anything that the governor had said or even hinted at, but she was hinting that we might come back in a couple of weeks to deal with transportation.
Interesting. It is very rare for the legislature to succeed in calling itself back into session. Be interesting to watch. All right. This does not directly affect the city, but it will have a huge effect on city residents. And so I wanted to kind of call this to council's attention. Council's probably aware that late last year, the Supreme Court ruled that the existing law that exempted agricultural workers from overtime pay, at least as it was applied to dairy workers, was unconstitutional. Now, that was a narrowly crafted case based on a class of workers in a specific field of agriculture, but it had been widely expected that the ruling would eventually be applied to all ag workers, and that what was of particular concern to the industry is if it were applied retroactively, meaning that all of these large ag farms and small farms would be on the hook for potentially years of back pay. So actually, in the lead on this were members of the Yakima Valley's legislative delegation, 13th District, 14th District, 15th District, all were among those working this issue. And a bill that I think Senator King prime sponsored, was the prime sponsor, became the vehicle for trying to address this in compromise legislation. Now, it ended up not being exactly everything that they'd originally wanted from it, but what it did end up doing is it buys the other parts of the agriculture industry time to phase in overtime provisions over the next 3 years. Starting January of 2022, workers will receive overtime for hours worked over 55 hours in a week. And by the time we get to January of 2024, then it'll phase in, and workers getting more than 40 hours will receive overtime pay. The other very important thing is it creates what they call a safe harbor process. This is to protect certain agricultural employers from having to pay back pay for employees who might file claims under this ruling for unpaid overtime that they felt entitled to in the past. Now, that can't apply to the dairy industry because the Supreme Court is governing that process and sent that back for further litigation on damages and back pay. That safe harbor doesn't apply to the dairy industry, but the other other ag producers will be able to seek safe harbor from back pay claims, and that has also now passed the legislature and awaits action by the governor. And then lastly, not a whole lot I'll say here, partly in the interest of time, but also there's not a whole lot that comes straight to the city out of this, but I just wanted to summarize for council some of the major elements of the operating and capital and transportation budgets as passed. There's a lot there. And we're still kind of going through it and seeing what that might mean for us. One thing I will highlight with all of the discussion of police reform, one thing that I think we were very pleased to see is increased capacity at the Basic Law Enforcement Academy. 5 more classes are being added in 2022 and in 2023. And I think, I'm not sure if this is the first time this has ever been done, but 3 of those 5 classes each year three of the classes each year must be conducted in Spokane. So Spokane and the academy over in King County are about the same distance for us, but it is nice to see the training being conducted, an option for folks in Eastern Washington. And with that, final slide is just outlining for you kind of what comes next. I figure next update will probably be on June 7th. By that point, we'll have an understanding of what bills the governor has signed or vetoed, or if he's done partial vetoes that modify them. And so we'll give you an update on any of these that we have more information on at that time.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. That was a very comprehensive and long report, and thank you for compiling all of that for us. Give a chance for everybody to ask questions again and make their comments. Councilor Hart, you're first up this time.
I just had one, I think I had one question regarding the I think it was House Bill 1220, that they had all those different things about housing, I believe it was. 1220, yeah. And these things are what, recommended at this point? They're not required?
The way the Growth Management Act was set up and the way these amendments came out in the final bill, these are optional for cities unless the legislature funds the planning costs. If they were to fund the planning costs, then they would change from optional to required, but right now they're just optional.
So, and this is probably going to, just one more question, applying towards our comprehensive growth plan.
Yes.
We need to be looking at this with kind of an eye towards how this particular bill is going to play out. If there will be.
It will, but Mr. Shuttleworth has been looking at this. And the other thing to keep in mind is some of this only applies to updates to plans scheduled in future years. So we're in the midst of our current update. Even if the legislature were to fund or require it, we might not be required to do this as part of this update. It'd be something we'd be looking at in a future update.
Okay. But it's good to be aware that this probably could come down to this.
It could, yes.
Yeah, okay. I think that was my only question.
All right,
Thank you.
Councilor Farmer, any questions?
Yes, I do. Back on HB 1220, where we talk about transitional or supportive housing must be permitted in any zone. This means R1 zones also, is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
Wow.
any zone in which any kind of residential or any kind of residence or hotels.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Counselor Hicks, any questions?
Yeah, mine's kind of in line with Council Farmer there. So basically, if it gets approved, the state gets to tell us what we can and can't do with our own land, right?
Yeah, well, to a certain extent, the Growth Management Act has set the principle that the state or the growth management hearing boards get to have a say in how local governments plan for growth and development, and that's been true for a while. This would extend the reach of that, specifically with regard to transitional and permanent supportive housing, because it limits cities' choices further in what they can or cannot restrict in their zones where residential dwelling units or hotels are allowed. It does still allow for certain standards, and I don't know if I've got that in my notes. It does still allow for certain health and safety standards, building code standards and so forth, but the use must be allowed is kind of how I'm reading it.
Well, that's all I had.
Counselor Henry,
Nothing from me, sir.
Counselor Restucci.
I only have one quick question. The legislature funded a study of the Growth Management Act, and I believe a committee's been formed to actually look at how it's being implemented across the state. I'm wondering if any of these bills affect that or have any connections to that.
Not that I'm aware of, but follow up with Mike Shuttleworth and see if we can't find anything out about, if we can find anything more out about where that study is or that process.
Thank you, sir. That's all I have.
All right, and I have no questions or comments that I want to make at this point either. So moving on to the next, unless you've got something else, Mr. City Manager, on this topic?
No, sir. Thank you.
All right. Item B under comprehensive plan update. Again, we will turn that over to you, Mr. City Manager.
Well, I'm going to turn this quickly over to Planning Supervisor Mike Shuttleworth. You've gotten the kind of a little introduction or taste of it with the discussion on House Bill 1220, but he's going to kind of give you a general overview of the process already underway and the work he's been doing with the Planning Commission to get ready to bring you updates for the various elements of our comprehensive plan.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Just want to start out first is to thank the Planning Commission for all the hard work they've been doing. The process we've kind of used with them is I will introduce a element of the comprehensive plan 1 month, and then the next month is when we'll actually discuss it. It gives them a good month to look at the information because some of the elements are fairly succinct and doesn't need a lot of required changes, and other of them need a lot of changes. The current one that they're looking at is the land use. And we've made in some areas quite a bit of changes and in other areas not much. And there are some areas, I believe about 15, that they need to look at and provide feedback on what they think we need to do. Next slide. As you may remember, back in 2020, we adopted a public participation plan, which directs how we will go about involving the public in the comprehensive plan update process. We have so far, all the Planning Commission meetings have been open to the public, and we have not really done a lot of public outreach at this point. What we're trying to do is get the plan with the information updated. So and when we go out and talk with the public, we have updated information that they can respond to and have fixed any issues or any things that need to be changed from the 2006 comprehensive plan. Some of the plan is being updated based on new data and other parts are being completely rewritten where the information in the 2006 plan is not applicable to today's situation. Next slide. As you can see, we're going from the 2006 plan to the 2021 plan. We're really a little behind on when we should have had our plan done. Once we complete the 2021 plan, our next update is scheduled for 2026. And that's when we'll probably have to look at some of that information we were just talking about with the legislative update that may impact it. I did have contact with Department of Commerce, the Growth Management Act group, a while back because I was concerned about some of the bills going through and how I needed to address them. And they said that they probably would not apply to us at this update, but they may at the next update. Just an answer to the question about the growth hearings or the group that's looking at the Growth Management Act. I have not seen anything come back out of that group, but I can contact one of the members that I know and see where that project is at and when they expect to have a some kind of document or presentation related to that. Next slide. So this is the Associated of Washington City has prepared a series of short videos on the comprehensive plan. This particular 7-minute video is why comprehensive plans matter, and I think it was good information for the City Council to be aware of.
Comprehensive plans are all about.
Can you hear it?
I cannot
No.
very much.
Each video contains a few key concepts and conversation starters that you can relate to. This page looks at why
Jackie, it's very
The
difficult
volume
to
is
hear
very
clearly.
low.
Yeah.
For the community to come together on their vision.
My tablet speakers aren't very loud. Let me try something else. No.
If it's the wish of council, we can send this video around via a link so that you can listen to it directly.
I think so.
I
Okay,
think that might be the best idea, Mr. City Manager.
Yeah.
all righty. We'll go ahead and, thank you, Jackie. We'll go ahead and skip to the next slide.
Yeah, and there is a series of short presentations by AWC you may want to watch when you're watching this one. They're very well done, and they are by various elected officials and members of the cities that, you know, such as city managers and such that have good information. This slide, so this is the Washington Growth Management Act, which was adopted in 1990, so it's a little before our legislative session this year, and provides that cities such as Sunnyside must adopt comprehensive plan. Each comprehensive plan and development regulations shall be subject to continuing review and evaluation by the city. In fact, the Growth Management Act now has specific timelines on which cities and certain counties must update their comprehensive plan, and this is more than just a minor update, but must have to look at everything that's taken place between the last time they updated and this time and what regulations and laws have changed that they need to address. In this list here, items 2, 3, or chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are required elements by the Growth Management Act, while chapters 1, 7, and 8 are optional elements. Chapter 1, while it's optional, does provide information that's required in the Growth Management Act for critical areas and other environmental issues. Next slide, please. So the first chapter we're looking at, and the Planning Commission has already reviewed this and made changes, and it's on hold until we get all of the elements done, and then we'll put them all together so everybody can see the whole document. This deals with environmental issues within the city of Sunnyside currently. This element, you will find information on groundwater, wetlands, hills, other environmental elements within the city. This chapter is probably going to be the one made up of mostly maps and information such as soils and others. Next slide, please. As you see here, this is a soil map of the city of Sunnyside, which is useful when we're looking at building codes and other codes where we would need to determine which type of soil you'll be putting in your structure on. As we look through this chapter, there were not a whole lot of changes because a lot of the soils and stuff don't change over the years. We are removing some areas, like there's a large amount of wording about floodplains. However, we found there are no floodplains in the city of Sunnyside or in its urban growth area, so there's really no reason to have a lot of discussion about that. Next chapter, next slide, please. The land use element, which is chapter 2, is the heart of the plan. And what this was to do is provide directions of how we develop in the future and how we address future growth of the cities. This one will contain population projections, land use projections. Also, we'll have zoning and any kind of information that's important, such as where are the industrial sites, where are other issues that may be influence how we do land use. Once the current data is reviewed, the city will determine what and where future land uses will be. So this will probably be a lot of discussion from the public on what they want to see. We have had 3 individuals send in letters requesting us looking at their particular sites. The existing comprehensive plan was based on a different urban growth area in about the 2015-2016 time period. Yakima County updated its urban growth area for the city of Sunnyside. Next slide, please. And this is a map of that urban growth area. There have basically designations for urban residential, urban commercial, urban industrial, urban public, and then park and open spaces. Whereas our zoning is more specific, like an R1, or R2, or R3 in different types of commercial. So what we will do in our comprehensive plan is in this urban growth area where we will do some pre-zoning. So in light of the discussion the other day, the last council meeting about the annexations and what type of residential zones should we be placing on those, we'll do this as part of the comprehensive plan process. So when they do come in, we will know what zones they are and how they're compatible with the surrounding areas. Next slide, please. Oh, on that last slide, excuse me. There are about 15 areas within the current comprehensive plan that the Planning Commission is looking closely at. One of them is there south of South Hill Road and north of the freeway. The county currently has it as industrial. Our current zoning in the city has it as industrial, but our comprehensive plan that was done in 2006 shows it as residential. So it's areas that we need to look at and determine exactly what we want to do with that. And there's about, like I say, 15 other areas where there's conflict between what we're zoning it and what the future land use map was showing that we need to look at and decide how we want it to grow. And that will be taking in the information, the data that's currently, so we know what it's currently being used for and how that affects what we can do with the vacant land around it. Next slide, please. So this chapter is the capital facility element, and this provides for public facilities within the city. These public facilities are not, so they would be like the city water, the city sewer, parks, schools, and other public buildings such as City Hall that we're in or police station. And what it is looking at those, basically the current status of those facilities. Are they up to code? Are they really needing some additions? Are we overstaffed or understaffed? Where do we need to provide for in the future of constructing a facilities. You know, it's kind of like looking at the swimming pool and saying the life of the swimming pool has 20 years. So in 20 years, we should be budgeting and figuring out that we probably will need a new swimming pool or something of that nature. Not that it's 20 years. This chapter did have quite a bit of information about the sewer plan and the water plan and other plans that are done as part of the, like the water and sewer plan are done as part of the those particular utilities. We're taking a lot of that information out because those plans are updated more consistently than the comprehensive plan is updated. So we just make reference to them so people can go to those documents and get the full information rather than spending a lot of time at the comp plan with that information. With that being said, then we will look at our capital facility plan and look at the facilities that don't get a lot of information, such as City Hall, police station, fire station, those other facilities that we need to start looking at in the future. When do we need to replace them? What's their useful life? Those type of things. So when we're doing capital facility plans in the budget, we can say, we know in X number of years, we probably should be looking at funding this type of thing. Next slide, please. So as you see here, this is the sewer plan, and it has a lot more information than we could ever relay in the comprehensive plan. So we'll just reference that document. It was updated in 2016. Okay, next slide. The transportation element is turning out to be an interesting element because I've done a few of them, but I'm finding that now as we look at the transportation element, we have to look at more technology than we did in the past. And this element, you know, we'll look at from roads to airports, mass transit to walkways, because we're in a time of transition where we found out this in the pandemic that a lot of people could work from home. In fact, the state is looking at some of their assets to see which can work from home and which need to come back in. And that will change decisions on transportation. The transportation secretary a while back was talking about looking at his budget, whether he should start, instead of planning for new roads, start planning for internet and wireless communications and stuff. That maybe that's more of an investment to get people off the road so we don't have to build as many new roads. So we also need to look at that. I mean, something we've done recently is the power facilities for automobiles there by the city park. And we need to maybe look at some more of those things as in the future we move to gasless vehicles and other alternatives for fuel. I know that I heard somewhere that Toyota probably after about 2026 will no longer have gas powered vehicles being imported into Europe, that most of all their cars will be some kind of electric cars. So we need to look at that as part of this transportation element. We have got some of it rewritten, and we also having the city engineers look at it to make sure there's no issues with funding and such in the future. Okay, next slide. And that's one of the things that it's coming up, is that the city's going to be looking at a master plan for their airport, and the airport is considered part of the transportation facilities for the city. It also, some of the things we need to start looking at, I know that some groups are looking at coming with electric airplanes and using them for commutes, like from Yakima to Spokane. Maybe we can get involved in that process if we plan for it out at our airport. So it's something we can start looking at, and you know, if not fully discuss it in the comp plan, we can have a mention of it so that when funding comes up, we can say, yeah, we would like to look at that. Next slide. This is a housing element. Seems like a lot of discussion at the state level was on housing. What we are looking at as part of our housing is housing for all income levels. So looking to make sure there's housing within Sunnyside for all income levels. And a lot of the analysis is coming back that we've done a pretty good job of all income levels. Just a side note on the housing element, I was talking to a realtor from the Tri-Cities the other day, and he said that there's, this is his words, 1,500 realtors in the Tri-Cities, and they only had 279 houses for sale. So that was to him, a very interesting time because they were taking bids on houses and such. So there's a demand for housing everywhere right now. And also the price of materials for those houses have gone way up. So we're trying to look at how that's going to impact us. And a lot of the initial information on this is looking at the data and seeing what we have. We do have an older housing stock in the city. And I have noticed, I've had quite a few people talk to me about how do we upgrade those. Some of those housing stocks are in commercial zones, which makes them have to jump through a bunch of hoops to upgrade them. I think in the comprehensive plan, we need to start looking at how do we promote the, the restoring and the reconditioning of those houses so it brings it up to new value, but doesn't mean they have to be tore down and a new house built. Next slide, please. As you see here, it's a census is where we get a lot of information on our housing, and there's quite a bit of data. We're kind of at that one point, and I wish we had better information, but the 2020 census won't be out for a couple of years for the data for the housing and such of that stuff. So it won't help us, but the information is pretty up to date, and we can look at housing and who's living in our houses and what population we need to serve and how many people we're going to serve. Our community is kind of a more younger community than some around us. So we have to look at what we need for housing for those in the future. Next slide. Utility elements. So this is kind of a short element, but it's looking at, when we talk about utilities, these are ones that are not the government owned. These are more power company, telephone company, those type of things that we need to address. And there won't be a lot of information in there because a lot of those companies don't want to give you their information because it's proprietary. So we're trying to work it as much as we can to make sure when we have development in a certain part of the city, we have electric available, we have gas available, we have those utilities available, which will impact growth just the same as roads and water and sewer. Next slide. As you can see, this chart is from the 2006 comprehensive plan, and we need to make some changes. Some of the group, such as telecommunication, they've changed names 4 or 5 times since then. Some of the irrigation districts are no longer there. So we need the information. We need to update that information so it's current with today's information. Next slide, please. This is economic development element. This is an optional element. The reason this is in there is to be able to look at our businesses and our economy to make sure that as we do our land use decisions, it's consistent with keeping businesses in the Sunnyside area that provide employment for our projected population growth, so that we continue to be a driver in the lower valley of economic growth. Next slide, please. And this is kind of the data we're looking at: graduation rates, population, income levels, what type of jobs they currently have, what type of jobs are available, and try to put some information together so when we do have somebody wanting to come in the city, they have good information about what we want to be in the future economically. Next slide, please. And the last element is the administration element, and it's a very short element. I think it's about 5 pages, but this has direction that tells us how we will make our updates to our comprehensive plan. We are required by the Growth Management Act to look at it once a year and allow people to suggest changes. So if somebody is in a comprehensive plan and their land use designation is residential and they think it needs to be commercial so they can rezone it commercial, then once a year, they can apply to the city and say, can I change that designation? The Growth Management Act does require it only to be done once a year, so people aren't doing it every month or something of that nature. They can apply anytime. We would docket it, and once a year, the Planning Commission would consider all changes. That's not the same as the major update that's required by the Growth Management Act. Okay, next slide, please. I know this is a quick overview of the comprehensive plan process, but the Planning Commission is working hard to create an updated draft that we can use for public review. Until it's finally adopted by the City Council, we will be making changes to the drafts the whole process through. The Planning Commission hopes to have a draft sometime this summer, probably middle, late summer, and then possibly we can have a joint meeting with the City Council to discuss the directions of the plan. Any questions at this point? I know it was kind of quick and through it, but.
Thank you, Mr. Shuttleworth. I'll go down the list and give everyone an opportunity to ask their questions or make their comments, and we'll start with Councillor Henry.
No questions for me, sir.
All right, thank you. Councillor Hart.
As we're going through that, the planning there, I was looking at those various maps, just trying to make sure that we are making, it's a little difficult to tell for what was residential, what was, unless you just know. It's kind of hard to read, but I just want to make sure that we are really paying attention to our population in as much as maybe there's, you know, we talk about moderately low income. We've got a lot of mid-density apartment building type things, but you know, that kind of residential where we can, for starter homes, that sort of thing. I'm sure the Planning Commission is probably looking at that in addition to all the other things they have on their plate. But so it looks like a good start. Thank you.
Councillor Farmer.
No questions.
Councillor Restucci.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. I want to thank the planning supervisor, Mr. Shuttleworth, for the work that he did on the presentation. I really appreciate that. I would remind council that when I got elected to council in 2003, we had 13,905 people living in the community, according to the census. We had about 5.8 square miles of land. Today, it's 6.2 square miles and 17,800. We've grown a lot in population, but we haven't grown in size. And I believe that's because of the restrictions of the GMA. And we need to look at that when we start thinking about our comprehensive plan, because we need to grow. Thank you.
Councillor Hicks.
No questions.
All right. Well, for my part, I do echo Mr. Restucci's words. Our population is increasing. Our space is growing rather slowly. And so I think we do need to think long-term. We need to think ahead in what will constitute the city of Sunnyside as far as space in the long term. And you guys have done a fabulous job getting started. I really want to commend you on the work that you've done. For me, looking at a map is always the key. I love maps of any kind. And so when I can see the map and I can read what zone it is and what the plan is for that, I really appreciate that work. So that helps me a great deal and understand. And I know we've been talking about the comprehensive plan for a number of years now. And so I'm really glad to see that we're making some progress on that. So thank you very much. Mr. City Manager, have you got anything to follow up?
I don't believe so. I believe the city clerk also added the upcoming council planning agenda, but I appreciate council's remarks with regard to the work of the Planning Commission and the planning staff on this. We're excited to be able to engage with you on these conversations coming up over the summer, and very much look forward to that.
All right. I'm just going to give people an opportunity to ask questions about our upcoming meetings. We talked about those at our last regular meeting.
Yeah.
But if there's any questions about these, now is the time to ask. So council, is there any questions about our upcoming meetings?
Oh, very good.
All right. Hearing none, and there being no further business to come before council this evening, if there's no objection, we are adjourned at 7:57. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you.